Hello and welcome to Retech, and today we're just going to continue with something that we were talking about on the last video, or on our retro review, which covers RetroBriting, because it's a kind of, it still happens now. A lot of people RetroBrite their machines, and I've never been a massive fan of RetroBright, but I want to put kind of the reasons why down onto this video, which, you know, might help you out kind of making your own decision on this. So what I did today is, because it was 27 degrees, which is about 81 Fahrenheit or so, so it was quite a nice warm day. It was quite bright, and it's the kind of weather where you just want to go down on your time off for a walk down the river, take the dog, take the kids out, go cycling and so on. But I decided to do a little bit of an experiment, you see, because RetroBriting, I've never believed, is the kind of solution to these machines. Now, I've kind of gone down a few different routes if you have a look at my videos, and if you have a look at one of the videos which concerns the TRS-80 color computer, just to make it really clear, it ruins the mechanical strength of the plastic, making it much more brittle than fresh ABS, which is, you know, most people do know that this is actually how it happens. The reason why RetroBright seems to work is not because of RetroBright itself, it's because of a bleaching agent. So everything you've heard about the RetroBright process is not entirely true. And, you know, obviously you can research the video yourself, and basically all it does is bleaches the plastic, which is why it also further damages the plastic. You know, really the only real way to stop the bleaching issue or the yellowing issue on an old computer is to try and reverse it slightly without using chemicals. Okay, so this is the original state the machine was in. The keyboard has been cleaned, and that's really about it, along with a wipe over of the machine. You can see the dents and marks along the front. It's not brilliant, but it's something that we need to sort out. Same as along the edge here, it's exactly the same. There are scuffs all over this machine. And as you can see, the case itself really does need seeing to and sorting out, because it is in a bit of a state. Right in the back, you've got more damage, more scuffs, more nicks, more dents. RetroBright won't get this out, you know, so it needed a lot more than that to really repair it. And you will see that I didn't RetroBright that machine whatsoever. Basically what I did was I cleaned the case and very gently flat sanded the case using very fine micro sandpaper, and the results have been brilliant. I mean, what I've got here is a machine that's I did almost 2 years ago. I flat sanded the machine, cleaned it off, made sure it was all functioning correctly, and that was it. And it's been a great machine, and it hasn't faded. It hasn't gone mucky, horrible, yellow, discolored or anything, which I'll show you now. Here is that machine in question. It's a Tandy color computer 2, and it's in just about immaculate condition. It's a little bit on the dusty side, mainly because it's been sat on the shelf for a while, but other than that, it's perfect. The case itself is in very nice condition. It hasn't faded, it hasn't turned to yellow, and it's still the original color. You can look all around the machine and you will see that it's color matched completely, and there was no RetroBright and no paint involved whatsoever on this machine. This machine is the color it left the factory, and that was by taking a tiny layer of plastic off, and it feels nice. It's nice and smooth, but it's not enough to get rid of the texture. So if you have a look at the video concerning this, you'll have a good idea of, you know, how I did it. It's very easy. and you just got to take your time and not kind of start digging into the plastic. And then once you've done that, it appears that it doesn't cause any more issues. The actual color changing chemical doesn't seem to come through. Now that might be because this is probably a different type of plastic, but I very much doubt it. It's still the cheap PC or cheap microcomputer plastic that they used of the day. So, you know, I don't think this is anything special. And I'll show you why. You see, this is my Commodore 128. You know, they're quite rare machines now. They're well, they're not massively difficult to get hold of, but they are very hard to get hold of now, especially in good working condition. And as you can see, the case itself looks quite nice, and the keyboard, although slightly yellow, is decent. And this keyboard is not as yellow as it was earlier on this morning, because basically the keyboard is a lot less yellow, and that's because it spent 3 hours out in the sunshine, and 3 hours was enough to make a difference on the keyboard. Now if I'd really wanted to, I could have left it out for the entire day, and basically there will be another marked change, and I'm going to put it back out probably for another few hours tomorrow. I'm only going to do it in stages, but the case itself, as you can see, is just about perfect. And this machine, although it is getting creaky, which we have to be a bit wary of, this again was flat sanded, and this was sanded very gently about 2 years ago, and as you can see, the color hasn't changed. And the keyboard was RetroBrighted. That's the only part of the keyboard I actually RetroBrighted on this machine, and as you can tell, the colors creeping back through. It's starting to yellow, and it was starting to yellow more noticeably than before I put it in the sun for a few hours. So it's going to go back out in the sun for a few hours tomorrow just to get that kind of deep yellow out of it, and we're going to try and get it a little bit more brighter and a little bit more whiter. But as you can see, the case hasn't changed color. So if you look at the top, the bottom, it's virtually the same color. Now although the keyboard is a little bit duller, it's not that bad. I think the worst is the spacebar. It seems to be the space-bars are made in a different factory for most of these micros, so you know they tend to discolor easier, or maybe it's because it's actually a longer piece. But you know, it's just an example of the fact that this case wasn't RetroBrighted. It was just gently flat sanded, very gently flat sanded. So I actually put a number of machines outside, and one of them was my old 65XE, and this one again, as you can see, back, sides, top is in very, very good condition. And I have to check because I wasn't sure whether I actually color matched this or not. As you can see, but I didn't. This one I actually again just cleaned and flat sanded. Now the way I could tell it's flat sanded is because it's got a nice, very smooth texture to it. Little tiny bit smoother, not visually smoother, but only to the touch, than the slightly rougher casting of the original kind of 65XE factory condition. But the color again hasn't changed, it hasn't come through. This must have been done about 2 years ago as well. And the keyboard was cleaned, and it was basically made to look a lot nicer. It wasn't RetroBrighted, it was using baking soda, which brought it up a really kind of half decent white, and it was quite nice. but again it started to yellow, but not as yellow as it was this morning before it was in the sun for a few hours. And again, it's kind of brought it back to life a lot better. Now I'm going to pop it in the sun again over the next sort of few days just to get that slight whiteness back on the keyboard, although they were never white. And I'll explain that in a minute, because a lot of people are getting far too engrossed in how white these cases and machines and keyboards are looking when they were never quite that way. But before we get into explaining that, we're going to take a look at this Amiga again. This case was just cleaned. It was just cleaned with a baking soda, and it was just cleaned up to make it look as nice as possible. I mean, it's not bad. It wasn't too bad anyway, and baking soda kind of brought the colour back, and all that left it was kind of a slightly yellow few keys on the keyboard. Now the space bar and a few of the other keys were very yellow, but again, a couple of hours in the sun and it's been fine. But the rest of the case has never turned back, and it stayed quite nice and bright, and it's, you know, it's a nice little Amiga. And I will get these other keys a little bit whiter, but again, that's just by putting them for a few more hours in sunshine. And it seems that sunshine isn't the enemy for these cases. A lot of people think that sunshine's the enemy for these machines, and it's the kind of catalyst to turn them yellow. Well, it's not, because if I can put these machines in direct sunlight, very hot day, 80, 85 degrees Fahrenheit and so on, and they don't immediately start turning yellow, in fact they start bleaching white again, then sunlight isn't the cause, okay? And it's not even direct kind of heat from the sun. Basically, UV light is the catalyst that seems to keep these machines white, these machines and these plastics in good condition. Now, accelerating that kind of phase with hydrogen peroxide, which is a bleach basically, okay, it accelerates it. It kind of, instead of 6, 7, 8, 9 hours in the sun, you're probably talking 3 or 4 hours in the sun to get a dramatic change, and the same lines of keeping them longer. Now, that's causing, what I can see is creaking and cracking to the cases, and this one's been in the sun and it's quite alright. It's not any different to the way it came out of the factory. It's not badly cracking and creaking. Now, I kind of think that it's general warmth and temperature changes that's doing it, that's causing the problem of the yellowing. It's not so much UV light, it's temperature changes without the UV light that's causing the changes to the plastics. And that means that really we should be putting things in direct sunlight at some point or another to help, maybe to preserve them. And I don't mean keep them in there for days, weeks and years, but just every now and again expose them to some UV. Maybe even a UV bulb from where you're storing them would possibly help preserve the colour of these machines. Now, although running UV lamps while they're in storage may not be the most sensible thing to do, but it's an option if you haven't got access to direct sunlight and for the length of time you need it, especially winter periods and so on. Now, if you're quite lucky, you know, in the same way as I am, we get sunlight from March all the way through to October, as in nice warm sunny days with kind of less than 7, maybe 6 or 7 days a month where it's not sunny enough to do it in that period. Then you know, you may have to kind of use a UV light, use an alternative. Now I'm going to do some experiments with UV lamps only, a low powered UV bulb only, on these machines to see if it has the same effect. I kind of think it might do. Without the chemicals, it might take longer, but without the chemicals, it might preserve the plastics for longer. Now, I'm kind of hedging my bets a little bit that this is going to be a good fix and it's going to be a long-term fix, but it's an educated experiment, it's an educated guess. Now, that's mainly based on the amount of times I've actually used hydrogen peroxide, and it's had a detrimental effect to cases, especially machines like the Atari ST and the Amiga 500s with a very thin, very cheap cases. And there's a marked difference once you've gone down the route of retrobriting them to their plasticity prior to retrobriting. So, you know, maybe it's something we need to do more experimenting on. But to get back to the other point, don't be too hung up on getting things white. You know, like the old soap powder adverts, it's whiter than white, because you'll find that all of these retro computers, even when brand new, were different colours to each other, and it depended on where they were manufactured, which country they were made in, how good the quality control was in those countries, etc., how good the pigment put into the plastic was, if it was perfect in comparison to its original specs or not. Most of the time it was there or thereabouts, and everyone was happy, and I'll show you why. This is a rather sad looking Atari ST spare keyboard. It's very yellow, and you might think, well, okay, so if you retrobright that, it's going to come back a nice white colour. Well, have a look at the back of the keys. They aren't perfectly white. They're more of a slightly off-white colour. Okay? And if I pull one of the keys, just to give you an idea, okay, it isn't perfectly white. Now, this keyboard is never going to be perfectly white. It's going to be more the lines of the backing plate colour, which is evident on the back of the keys right there. Okay, so that's the colour you'd expect this keyboard to go, which is this machine here. Now, this machine, okay, it's very good condition. It was restored using colour matching. And before you say it doesn't look the right colour, well, this is an original case, unpainted, and this is the colour match case. Okay, so they're virtually identical. So you can do it, and colour matching will actually keep the cases a lot longer in better condition, because it's sealing out any effects from the ozone basically, and it's also sealing out any effects from temperature changes because it's got a coating on it, and it's also preserving the plasticity of the original plastics because it's keeping the oxygen out of it. So, you know, there are massive plus points to colour matching a case. But look at the keyboard. The keyboard is, if you look all around it, is roughly the colour, whether it's on the back of the keys, the side of the keys, the front of the keys and so on. It's perfect just about all the way round. So there's no difference in colour. So you'd expect, okay, your keyboards to come out that kind of colour. Now, most people would have thought, well, I'm sure they were whiter than that. But as you can see, the side of the keys and the top and the backs, and how uniform the function keys are in colour, you can see that there's no difference, there's no change in color across the keys. So that's quite a nice machine. And again, that keyboard was put out in the sun for a few hours just to, you know, make sure it's a nice uniform color. And as you can see, there isn't any change in color between the front of the keys and the top of the keys. They're all pretty uniform. But if I pick up my spare, or one of my spare Atari computers, which I need to refurbish. Now this computer's in a fairly bad way, but look at how bright the keyboard is. You'd think that had been retro-brighted, but it hasn't. It's just the way the keyboard is. The keyboard on this is the original keyboard for this machine. It hasn't been stripped or pulled apart. The case is awful, but the keyboard is nice. But you can tell by just looking at this front and the sides of the keys that it's a uniform color, and it's a whiter color. So if you compare it to those, you can see how much whiter that is to that. And yet the colors, the keys are uniform on here in color, and the keys are uniform on this one in color. And it wouldn't matter how much you retro-brighted the hell out of this keyboard, you'd never get it to that color, because this machine was manufactured in a completely different part of the world. Okay, this one was Sunnyvale, and this one was in Hong Kong. And this machine, which has got the Sunnyvale tag on it with a nice bright keyboard, was manufactured in Taiwan. So, same machine, built in two different countries, to two different qualities or two different dies within the mouldings. Every computer from Taiwan will have a brighter keyboard than the machines manufactured in Hong Kong, and that's also quite evident with the colour of the case as well. If you look at the bottom of this case, right in here, you'll see it's a very greyish colour, kind of a mid-grey. Now this one, all over the case, right in the bottom, it's a slightly different colour grey. You hope might not show up so well on the camera, but it's not as grey as the one manufactured in Taiwan. So again, if you retro-brighted both machines and you kept them with the same amount of chemicals, same amount of bleaching, same amount of time, you would have two different machines of two slightly different shades, in fact two very different shades of colour in this time. And that doesn't just go for these machines, it goes for all machines of the era. And it doesn't matter if it's an Atari or an Amiga or a 64 or a VIC-20 or even Sinclair ZX Spectrums, where they were made in different countries, and the kind of the texture is very different on the plastics on both machines. So, you know, you've got the same issue from all over the world. And with the Commodore 64, it was kind of a throw of the dice as to whether you were getting the VIC-20 case or the Commodore 64 case of the same model. So the bread bin case came in virtually two different sizes. One was slightly taller and rounder than the other, but without a side-by-side comparison you wouldn't know. And that would be the same for these, the Atari STs and also the Amigas, etc. Now I colour matched an Amiga and it came out slightly creamier than what I would have expected the Amiga to come out. You're talking a shade difference. It's more along the line of the Commodore 128 in colour that it came out. And I thought, well, it's fine. It's, you know, it's clean, it's tidy, it works. It's not the horrible yellow color that it originally was. But I kind of, being me, I looked into it and I found that even they were different. You had different shades of their beige color. It ranged from a whiter shade all the way down to a dark hue. But you'd not notice unless you had them side by side. So all of this scramble to get them to factory spec. Well, which factory? Which spec? Because they were so different from country to country and factory to factory, even in the same countries. And that's the whole point, and this is probably my biggest point, is we are trying to achieve, or a lot of people are trying to achieve, perfection on these machines when they weren't perfect to start off with. They just weren't. Even the likes of Commodore, which was kind of a giant in the microcomputer arena at the time, and it produced a lot of ICs and CPUs for all of the other fledgling microcomputer manufacturers, and even the International Space Station uses some of the 6502 processors. They weren't perfect. They were never going to be perfect because of the era it was. And to that end, we shouldn't be worrying about whether or not, you know, we get the absolute perfect shade of beige or white or cream or grey. What we need to worry about is to preserve the plastics once the machine is preserved itself. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to have much fun with a perfectly preserved internals of a machine with a case that you daren't touch because it's falling apart. So yeah, that's my little kind of 15-minute foray into what we should and shouldn't do, or maybe what I shouldn't do, because at the end of the day I was as guilty as everybody else to trying out the retrobriting kind of route. And you know, initially I got good results from it on a couple of machines that I've done, but looking into it a little bit further, I wasn't happy with the more brittle plastics that you were left with. And also it comes back through. After a very relatively short period of time, the colours start to change again, which is why really my money would be on colour matching. Colour matching the product, and then you're not going to get any more issues from yellowing. So that's it really. You've got a few options. You've got sanding the cases to take the leaching out of the top layer, and also I think by gently sanding the top layer away, you're actually getting rid of some of the reactions that cause it later on in its years as well, because you're getting rid of that. You're literally sanding it off and blowing it away, and what you're left with is the original color underneath that small micro layer of plastic. Now you have to be careful, because you can take too much off and you can change the texture of the case, which is the downside. But if you're careful enough and you take your time enough, none of that will change. Now if you want to make it a bit more long term, as in easier as well, then color matching and painting, because if you get the slightly wrong shade, you can always redo it, or you know, live with it in the fact that it might be slightly wrong shade of color, but it's going to keep the machine together for a lot longer, and it's going to preserve the plastics at the end of the day. Or you can go down the route of RetroBriting. Now if you've got a heavy enough or thick enough plastic case, well, it's not a bad idea to probably give it a one-shot RetroBright and see what happens. But if you've got something with a bit of colour in it, such as the Atari platforms, you will get striping and you will get mix match of colours across the case, which can look worse than leaving it kind of the yellowish colour anyway. I mean, to be honest, this is an unrestored, in need of repair Atari, and it's kind of this yellowish kind of off colour. But if you hadn't seen that, would you really have known any difference? And if you sat there playing games on it or whatever, trying the machine out and using the machine, would it really matter whether the case is not quite the original colour it came out the factory or not? Because how many people are running around in cars that are only a few years old which aren't quite the original colour they came out the factory in? You know, we've all got used to that kind of subtle colour changing on things such as exterior work, doors, window frames, cars, any outside piece of garden furniture, you name it, it will all eventually change colour. Now, in the garden world, it's called rustic and it adds character. Well, that's adding character, in my mind anyway, and probably in a lot of other people's minds who really just want to use the machine as it is and try and keep it long term. So yeah, so that's my thoughts on this. And it's not only computers that are being affected. I've got keyboards. I have an Oxygen MIDI keyboard just sat over in the corner there, which isn't that old, and the keys are yellowing. They are literally yellowing worse than this microcomputer. And underneath I have a same make and model MIDI keyboard which I use for other things, and it's yellowing. And yet I have two Yamaha keyboards which have almost perfect colour keys, and one of them's 30 years old and the keys are perfect. So again, it depends on the quality of the plastics as well that were being produced at the time. So don't get hung up on trying to get something 1000% perfect, because they weren't anyway. Don't get hung up in trying to match every single colour of every single Atari or Commodore out there, because you won't, because they were all subtly different. And at the end of the day, preserve them and use them and enjoy them, and that's what it's all about. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it gave you a bit more food for thought on my last video, which was a retro review where I mentioned what the 8-bit guy had said and what he'd kind of concluded as well, and I thought I'd give you a little bit more information on that. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe and I hope to see you soon. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Bye bye.